Hey everybody, what's up? I'm glad to be back. So welcome to my channel. This is Lance Independent, where basically every week I talk about how much I disagree with moral realism. And I don't know, lately I've been talking about a lot about meta philosophy stuff. So I've become increasingly critical of analytic philosophy. So we're going to continue with that because that's pretty much all I talk about here. So if you're really into super narrow and obscure content of someone that is really critical of analytic philosophy and has critical things to say about moral realism, great, welcome, because that's what I do here. And I don't think there's any other channels that do that. We do have a few anti-realists around. We got Kane B, who has a great philosophy channel, which you should go check out. So one of the things that Kane B does is Kane B will take some contemporary literature, some important topics, concepts, ideas, papers, that sort of thing, and then organize a discussion around a particular topic. It could be, and there's a whole series of meta ethics videos, but Kane B is much more broad in scope and in covering a lot of different areas of philosophy. And then you'll get a fairly, at least I think, neutral and good take on just characterizing. Here's what this person says. Here's what this person says, and then Kane will give a kind of analysis and some criticism, usually towards the end of the video. Sometimes there's not a whole lot of that. Sometimes there is, but it's great. It's different kind of content than what I tend to do here, which so far has largely been improvised theory. So there was this time I had some students, and I don't know what brought this on, but I was like, what motivates you? And I was like, you know what motivates me? And then I had to think about it. I was improvising, and I was like, anger. So what I try to do is there's lots of things that frustrate me, and I try to channel that anger energy into productive work. And it really feels like a kind of energy that I can use to get stuff done. So you'll see that I often get very animated, and I get really talkative, and I might gesticulate wildly when I'm talking about analytic philosophy or intuitions or meta-philosophical stuff or experimental philosophy or whatever the many topics that I talk about on here, which again, I say many, but it's pretty narrow. You'll see I'm all energetic right now. Okay, so anyway, so I can get that way. I don't know what kind of impression that could give people like that. I don't like the way in which I see a lot of philosophical debates occur, where people want to take cheap shots at one another and digs and kind of be a smartass. I used to do that a lot. I might still sometimes find myself doing that, but I'd prefer not to. I really want to have conversations with people that hold contrary views, as long as we can get along and have what seems to me to be a productive discussion. I don't want to have these like unpleasant back and forths. So I'm particularly interested in people that are proponents of, I guess you could say, mainstream analytic philosophy. Oh, I should just say, if you're not familiar with the distinction, because I'm always saying analytic philosophy, I use this term contemporary analytic philosophy, or I might say mainstream analytic philosophy. I don't know which one of those terms I like better. So analytic philosophy is largely it's sort of a subcategory that arose over the past couple centuries. It gradually arose largely in the Anglophone world. And the term is usually used to distinguish philosophy that's largely dominant in the UK, the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. So predominantly those places, from continental philosophy, which is mostly associated with France and Germany. And it's this division within the field where there's a different sort of emphasis. There are people that kind of traverse or cross over or are familiar or work kind of in both areas. So it's not like these are two totally disparate areas of philosophy and that nobody ever reads anybody in the other areas. There are people that, there's continental philosophers that I've read. But there's a kind of difference in emphasis. And in, the analytic tradition in the United States, I think what's really interesting about it is how recent it is. I shouldn't say the United States, like the United States, UK, it's hard because people are in different sorts of places. That tradition is really recent. And one of the things that really has started to bother me about it is that, when I was learning, studying philosophy, taking courses, there was a huge emphasis on history. And that history, was replete with a whole lot of ways of doing and thinking about and approaching philosophy that are in some ways, at least institutionally, pretty different from the way they are now. Like, for instance, the peer review, like this systematic, everything has to be peer reviewed thing. This is only a few decades old. This is pretty recent. So, now there's all this emphasis on having a PhD. I don't think Socrates didn't have a PhD. So the field has become a lot more entrenched in this kind of a institutionalization of the what is done in the field. And, there are advantages to, formalizing things and having, textbooks and all that sort of stuff. But I also think there can be some substantial disadvantages. And one of my concerns with what's happened over the past century is it's almost like people are forgetting that a lot of this stuff is really, really, really recent. And I think that there is a lack of appreciation for, I'm not sure exactly what the best way to frame this is, but you could say the kind of cultural contingent or path dependent nature of the field. So you can imagine, this is one thought experiment you can imagine. So a lot of older philosophical works have been destroyed or they're lost, and we have fragments. Often it's a fragment, from what I've heard, I'm not a historian of philosophy, is not so much like we have one little strip from a scroll of something somebody said, like here's something Democritus said, something like that, but rather there are references to or quotes of things philosophers have said in other works. So, you might have Plato saying, hey, here's something Democritus said. And you can imagine a kind of counterfactual. What if it hadn't been like, all of Plato's work was lost? Someone really hated the dialogues or something, and they gathered it all up and they burned it all. And then we had recovered, in some ancient cave that was rediscovered, the works of some, I don't know, Thales, or like everything written by Epicurus, like perfectly preserved. And so we had a very different sort of initial foundation for Western philosophy other than Plato and Aristotle. What if it was instead like Democritus and Lysippus and Epicurus, just to pick people that come to mind for me, what if that had happened? What if we had a whole bunch of Parmenides or something? How would the field look like today? Because you've had people characterize that, people have said, philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. At least a particular trajectory within philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. Well, what if we had nothing from Plato? It wouldn't have been a series of footnotes to Plato. Who would it have been a series of footnotes to? Maybe nobody in particular, or maybe somebody totally different. How much different would the field be today? What kinds of topics would people focus on? What would the discourse be like? I don't even know what philosophy would look like if there weren't that persistent residual influence of Platonistic thinking. I mean, one thing you might wonder is, would the Platonistic thinking reemerge? And is there something about the philosophical views that have been dominant or at least influential in contemporary analytic philosophy, and I guess you could say in the recent history of analytic philosophy, would people reliably reconverge on those same ways of thinking, those same positions, and so on? Or would the field have been radically different in its focus, its emphasis, the terminology, the topics we discuss, the way we address those topics, the way we think about those topics? I don't know. But, one thing I really emphasize is that I see what philosophers are doing. Philosophers think, we're not out with particle accelerators. I mean, unless you're doing philosophy of physics, maybe you'd care about what data from a particle accelerator. We're not out busting out microscopes and telescopes and conducting studies and doing this sort of thing, at least most of the time. I do empirical research, but most philosophers probably don't. And if they do, it's not going to be the main part of their work. So philosophers are relying on a very particular tool, the mind. And the mind is, I see the mind as what the brain is doing, or you could say it is the brain. There's different ways of phrasing this. I don't want to get too pedantic about saying, which particular view of philosophy of mind are you endorsing there? Nothing in particular. I'm just speaking colloquially. My point here is that philosophers are using a particular tool. And what I find interesting is that the typical disciplines we would use to study that tool, the mind, would be cognitive science, psychology, maybe linguistics. Like, you would think that there's a range of fields that we would care about the content of those fields and what they tell us about the tools that we're using. It would be very strange if a physicist was not interested in how the physical instruments that they use to gather data worked, if meteorologists did not care about how thermometers and barometers and whatever other equipment they use, you don't have to be an engineer and personally know how to build this equipment, but you do need to have some reliable means of knowing what works, why it works, how it works, when it's not working, which ones work and which ones don't work, and how you can tell the difference. You would think that the scientists working in these fields do care about those questions, even if they don't have deep and extensive knowledge of them. I don't know that every scientist needs to know, like, does every biologist need to know exactly how you build a microscope? Probably not. But if there wasn't a person or people we could consult, say, hey, how do these things work exactly? I think biology would probably be on shakier footing. And these fields have progressed in large part because there is reliable information about the efficacy and the sort of confidence we could place in the utility of the instruments that we're using. So philosophers are relying on this particular instrument, the mind. And I'm not saying that philosophers don't care about psychology, but they strike me as suspiciously insufficiently curious about its mechanisms and how it operates. So what you'll see today is this constant appeal to intuitions, and yet you see very little, to me, very inadequate coverage of what are we talking about when we're talking about intuitions. Are we talking about a natural kind? Are we talking about a sui generis type of psychological state? Are we talking about a range of different psychological states? Philosophers love to make clear and precise distinctions. If we're talking about different sorts of things, why aren't they drawing out the different distinctions? And I'm not saying there isn't work on this. It's my engagement with this work that is prompting me to say these sorts of things. There is work on these questions, but metaphilosophical work is largely at the periphery of a lot of these disputes. I was never introduced, and it wasn't a sort of required or main part of my training as either an undergraduate or a graduate student in philosophy, to read I didn't have a single course on metaphilosophy. I had to go out of my way to pursue this material on my own. They weren't offering courses on metaphilosophy. That wasn't a thing. That's strange, because if you pursue a degree in the sciences, you typically are going to take research methods course, statistics courses. You're going to learn about the instruments you use to do what you do. And our philosophers typically, is it a requirement of a degree to take a heuristics and biases course and learn about how the mind works? And should we learn about anchoring and adjustment and scope neglect? There's a availability heuristic. There's a variety of things in cognitive bias research that could be of potential value for people to learn. And yet it's not a requirement. It seems like you don't need to understand how the tool works. And there's a insufficiency in the discussion around this topic. So there are a few people that have, for instance, challenged whether or not and to what extent philosophers rely on intuitions as evidence, either historically or contemporaneously. You have Capellan, Maschery, NATO. There's a few people that have written papers on this topic who have either forcefully argued for this or gone over and assessed this type of work. There are other people that have critically responded to this and said no, philosophers do use intuitions. That literature's out there, but it's not a huge literature. It's not like everybody in the field is trying to figure this out. Whereas comparatively, if you look in psychology, again, there's a lot less of it than I think there should be, but there is at least extensive discussion since the replication crisis of, hey, should we rely on p-values? And when people write papers on this, they might write a random behavioral sciences article or something. You get, a bunch of responses with, in some cases, multiple co-authors. And so a lot of people are engaging in this. I don't see a lot of people engaging with the book Philosophy Without Intuitions. I've seen some people respond to it, but a lot of times the responses are, that's ridiculous and I'm not going to entertain it, which is fine. That's a fine view. Like, I don't think it's as ridiculous as they do, but okay, at least they're responding to it. But I didn't take a course on philosophy without intuitions. Why is it so obvious philosophers use intuitions? Well, someone might say, well, because they say that they do, which I agree that they say that they do that. But we can still ask the question, what exactly does that mean? Who's using these intuitions? What do they mean by intuition? And if you go, for instance, to the SEP, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy page on intuitions, you'll see, as you do with so many other philosophical issues, nobody agrees about anything. Everybody has a different account. But the thing is, it's one thing for everybody to disagree on how to characterize free will or what the correct account of free will is. It's another thing for people to disagree on what knowledge is and how to characterize knowledge. It's quite another to, in the case of philosophy, for us to disagree or to not even really adequately address the metaphilosophical framework in which these discussions are occurring. And I don't think it's adequately explored. And I find that deeply puzzling. Uh, we don't care how we're doing what we're doing. What exactly are we doing? And why are we doing it the way that we're doing it? And are there other ways that we could be doing philosophy? And what are the merits of the way that we are doing philosophy relative to the ways that we could be doing philosophy? There just isn't a lot of discussion about this. And you would think philosophers would want to get super meta. And maybe they do get meta, and I'm not in philosophy departments where they're talking about this all day. So if you're in a philosophy department and they're talking about this, let me know. But at the very least, I could say it's not reflected as this ubiquitous feature of the philosophical literature. It's present, but it's not as present as I would have expected if we were really serious about getting to the bottom of what we're talking about when we're talking about intuitions, or what our methods are if we were really serious about those methods. And, even if you look at that work, it's very contentious what the correct answers are, if any, and it's not altogether clear to me what's going on there. Okay, so I want to be more mindful of the comments. There was a couple weeks ago, or I was responding to comments like an hour later. So, hey, Brenda, hello. All right, what's up? Okay, having to tune in. I really like that you show up and say hi, even when you have other stuff to do. I should consider, varying my schedule and arriving at different times, and doing different sorts of things just to see if different crowds show up at different times. Anyway, I wanted to be a bit more relaxed today. A lot of times I say that, but I just started going for 15 minutes, just whatever came to my mind. But I want to try to be a little more relaxed today and see what people have to say in the chat. I see a few people here. So does anyone have like general questions or comments or stuff that I didn't get to last week or the past, whatever it is? I want to keep my responses, at least for now, focused on the topics that I cover. But if there's stuff that, you've wanted to ask me and I never get to it, or always get to an hour later and you're not around, let me know in the chat. And just generally speaking, how's everyone doing? I'd like to have this be more interactive today. I've had a few of these lives where it's a bit more interactive, so hopefully we could get it there. I'm definitely going to switch out this camera. I've tried to deal with the autofocus, and it's just not working to get it to do what I want it to do. It just keeps wobbling, so I'll have to fix that. Anyway, is anyone around? If they're not, I guess I'll get to what I talk about. Often this picks up maybe 30, 40 minutes and we have a larger number of people. Oh, I got a hey. How's it going? So yeah, if you have a question or something, let me know. Ooh, so this is a good one. What's the best argument for moral realism in your opinion? It's something that I want to do, is to kind of do a rundown of the arguments for moral realism and maybe rank them as what's best or worst. What do I think the best argument is? And so it's good for me to be thinking of this now. I'll just tell you what my initial inclination is, which is to say that it's some type of argument that is going to appeal to the explanatory value of moral facts in a way that's publicly valuable. So I don't generally buy, I don't think that, for instance, appeals to phenomenal conservatism do very much, because all they really manage to do is provide justification, but that justification is private. It's not publicly available. So for instance, Mike Huber might say, if it seems to you that something is true, that provides defeasible justification for believing is true in the absence of defeaters. And let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, that we accept that that's true, and it seems to you that moral realism is true. Okay, well, then you have some justification in believing in moral realism in the absence of defeaters. Okay, but it doesn't seem to me that it's true. And I'm not obligated to accept your seemings as having any sort of priority over my seemings. And so if it seems to you that something's true, and in virtue of that, you're justified in believing it, okay. But philosophical discourse, I would assume that the purpose of what we're all doing when we're talking to one another is to mutually work together to try to figure out what's true. And someone just saying, well, it seems to me that something's true, and unless you've got a good argument against it, I'm justified. Well, even supposing that that's true, there's not, okay, well, maybe I don't have an argument, but that doesn't mean I have to accept that it's true. And the example I typically give for this is, let's say you're in the woods and you encounter Bigfoot, and it's a very clear, you spend hours observing Bigfoot. You have all sorts of data. You even have photos. You examine the photos the next day. You have really good reason to believe you're not hallucinating or something. and then your camera breaks or you drop it in a river or whatever. And let's say you're in a very remote area, so this isn't super duper implausible. So you're just in way, way, way deep in northern Canada, and it's like really dangerous, and you lose your camera. In that case, I would say you're justified in believing that Bigfoot is real. You saw it, and you had a lot of time to observe it. But if you then return to human civilization and said, I saw Bigfoot in the woods, I still think you'd be justified in believing it, but no one else would be under any obligation to believe you. It would be reasonable for them to think you did not see Bigfoot, that you're making it up, that you were tricked, something. And so I think appeals to phenomenal conservatism put you in largely the same position where, yeah, okay, maybe you are justified. Now what? Okay, so you're justified being a realist. Bye? Like what? I would have thought we would want arguments that actually persuade others, that have dialectical force. And appeals to phenomenal conservatism do not on their own have any dialectical force. So if I had to pick some argument, it might be some type of explanatory indispensability argument, like there's something that realism is explaining that we wouldn't be able to explain without it. So something like that. Those would probably be the best arguments, and depending on the form that they take. I really don't find, I think a lot of people would want to say that companions and guilt arguments, those are pretty popular right now. I think those are really unpersuasive. And I think a lot of people think those are good arguments, and I do not. I don't find epistemic realism or any other type of normative realism to be any more plausible. And I have not found the critiques, saying that if you endorse a global normative global normative anti-realism, where you don't believe in any form of normative realism, including epistemic norms, that's somehow self-defeating. I don't think it's self-defeating, because I don't accept the standards of self-defeat implicit in those claims, or if they're made explicit, it's very unlikely I would accept those. I don't accept their conditions for self-defeat. So I don't think I need to have reasons for belief of the form that I think realists think that you need to have. So I don't think those are very persuasive. All right. Objective value doesn't make sense to me analytically. Value seems like something that has to be mind dependent. Something judges something else to have worth, purpose, or use to themselves. Yeah, so I'm pretty sympathetic to this view. I'm pretty sympathetic to me. It's a funny way to phrase it. Well, of course, I'm pretty sympathetic to me. But yeah, I'm pretty sympathetic to this view. And this is something that it's probably the thing I'm best known for, which might not be a good thing, which is what I'm coming around to just calling the unintelligibility thesis. So the most common anti-realist positions that you will see are, I'm going to have to start using my own terminology because I don't like the terminology that's out there, are error theory, non-cognitivism, and these days most people just say expressivism, and what you could say are stance dependence accounts. Now, error theory is going to be the view that first-order moral claims are systematically false, typically because they contain an implicit presupposition that's false. So, for instance, if moral claims are claims about God's will, but God doesn't exist, then those claims are systematically false. The most common form of error theory holds that moral claims are implicitly committed to some type of objectivity or stance of dependence, that, in other words, they're committed to some sort of metaphysical thesis. That thesis is false, and therefore all moral claims predicated on that thesis are false. So, for instance, this is typically framed in terms of a sort of conjunction of a variety of claims, but the most central ones that it makes sense to focus on would be the semantic thesis and the metaphysical thesis. The semantic thesis would be something like moral claims purport to describe stance-independent moral facts. There are no stance-independent moral facts, so those claims are failing to describe reality as it is. If that sounds strange, just imagine if someone went around describing unicorns and they're like, unicorns love to eat clover sprouts or something. And someone goes, no, they love to eat alfalfa a lot more than clover. Unicorns don't exist, so both the statements would be false. But, unicorns prefer chocolate over vanilla, false. They don't have preferences. Unicorns prefer vanilla over chocolate, also false. They don't have preferences. Why? Because they don't exist. And so claims that presuppose something is true, claims about the dietary habits of unicorns are all going to be false. And I say first order for a reason, because if someone said there are no unicorns, or if someone said it's not the case that unicorns prefer X over Y. A statement like that might be true because you could say, well, why don't they prefer it? You say, because they don't exist. They don't have preferences. That statement would be true, but that is not a first order claim. So the first order claims are the claims that carry this sort of implicit presupposition. I'm spending too long times describing error theory. So that's error theory. Then you're going to have expressivist accounts. And so these accounts, there's actually positions that sort of are wedged between these categories. So quasi-realism might be one of them. So some accounts are going to try to cash out moral claims in a way where they don't have the ontological import that error theorists describe to those claims. But they still want to claim that there's some deflationary account of truth or whatever. And so that one has, in a certain sense, and I've seen this phrasing before, earned the right or somehow achieved the capacity to make truth-apt moral claims without those claims carrying the metaphysical implications that error theorists attribute to moral claims. On the flip side, there actually are some realists that might actually agree with certain forms of like more deflationary conceptions of truth. And so you're going to get some interesting crossovers in certain elements of the different meta-ethical positions that cross the aisles in a certain respect between realists and anti-realists. And some of this sort of aisle crossing, or you could say sort of conceptual bridges, whatever you want to say, are in some cases actually there are greater resonances between naturalist realist positions and anti-realists in a certain respect. So for instance, some naturalist realists might think that moral claims or moral facts are a certain kind of descriptive fact, and they're not going to find them to have any greater normative authority than the anti-realist would. And that might be so fundamentally at odds with how non-naturalists think about the moral facts that they would consider naturalism to be functionally not very practically different from anti-realism in some ways. So you should keep in mind that when you're characterizing the different positions that are out there, that there are ways in which they're both similar and different from one another. Anyway, so we've got error theory. First order moral claims are systematically false. Then you have these accounts that, I was starting to describe expressivist accounts, but we could just go with a simple type of non-cognitivism, which holds that moral claims are not truth-apt. They're not even the sort of things that could be true or false. And this might be framed in the sort of traditional terms because they convey some sort of emotional state or they express imperatives. So on these views, you could kind of translate a moral claim that looks superficially like a sentence, like a proposition that could be true or false. Murder is wrong. That looks like it is raining. It looks like something that could be true or false. And you could say, actually, a better understanding of what's going on here is that it's actually expressing an emotion or it's expressing an imperative. And the example I tend to give is a child trying to sneak out of the house to go to a party. Parents catch them. Parents say, you will not go to that party. That looks like an assertion, but it's actually functioning in the context of usage as an imperative. And so a cognitivist might say that a better analysis of moral claims is that they're expressing some sort of imperatival or emotional function where they're not actually attempting to assert anything true or false. And in that case, moral claims, there are no moral facts because morality isn't even in the business of stating things that could be true or false. The last category we could call stance dependence. I would prefer that over relativism because relativism is another one of these cases where it sort of crosses over into both areas. So you could read Richard Joyce talking about this. I think it's now in the main section of the SEP article on relativism, but Joyce used to have this supplemental section that I thought was really good that distinguishes, I don't remember the exact terminology Joyce appeals to, but here's roughly how I would characterize it. And I think this is pretty close to Joyce. Relativism treats moral claims as having an implicit indexical element that allows the truth status of moral claims to vary in accordance with some relativized standard of value. In practice, that's typically people's stances. It could be the stances of people or the stances of cultures. And that's when you get your sort of individual subjectivism and your cultural relativism, respectively. But indexicalization is a feature of, give me one moment. Oh no, I muted it. My bad. uh, oh no, how long was I muted? Where was I at? Oh, that's a fun one to include here. Sorry, I was drinking and I was worried that it was going to be like loud and I was going to make some noises. It's lost forever now. You're right. I always make goof ups like this. I'm gonna keep this one in here, just because it's fun. It's fun to just goof up things like that. All right, man. No audio for like 2 or 3 minutes. No. Okay, so let me pick up where I left off. So I was describing relativism, I think, right? Indexicalization. That's right. I'll just do it over. I've described indexicalization enough times. Okay, so indexicalization. Also, my gestures must have been really weird if I did that whole thing like this. 1 second. Okay. So, indexicalization. So the relativist could understand moral claims to function this way. When I say murder is wrong, I mean murder is inconsistent with my moral standards. When you say murder is wrong, you're saying murder is inconsistent with your moral standards. There's different types of relativism. It could be relativized to the standards of individuals. It could also be relativized to the standards of different groups. So when I say murder is wrong, if I'm a cultural relativist, I might mean something like murder is inconsistent with the standards of my culture. And as you can see, this allows the truth status of the claims to vary in accordance with who the speaker is. Now, the thing about that is, in most cases of the actual forms of relativism people endorse, those forms of relativism are going to be they're going to be indexed to different people's stances. And so that makes them both relativistic and stance-dependent accounts. What makes those accounts anti-realist accounts is not the relativism, it's the stance dependence. So realism is the view that there are stance-independent moral facts. And so whether those facts are relativized or not is irrelevant to whether they're stance-independent or not. Just think of motion. Motion is relative. And yeah, it's not like it's entirely determined by our attitudes or preferences, what direction or speed or whatever velocity you're moving in. So although motion is relative, that doesn't mean that motion is stance dependent. It's not. And by stance dependent, I don't mean that different people at different points of view, you have like, Einstein, there's these thought experiments, that different people would see different things from different points of view. It's not about that. It's that stance dependence in meta-ethics means it's a position on what serves as the truth makers for the moral claims, that the moral claims are made true by one's stance, not by the one's like vantage point in space. And so it's the actual like attitudes or values or beliefs of the agent that makes it the case that the claim in question is true. In other words, a stance dependent account, let's take a simple individual subjectivist account. What makes it true that murder is wrong when I say murder is wrong is that I think murder is wrong. That's what makes it true, the fact that I think murder is wrong. And if I stopped thinking murder is wrong, it would stop being true when I said murder is wrong, that the statement murder is wrong when I say it is true. So you see, my attitude or my belief or my stance or my value, there's different ways you could characterize it. That's making it true. And that's not the case for like relativistic motion, where it's not like if I prefer to be moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour, then I am moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour. That's not how that works. Okay, so technically that indexical element can come apart from the stance dependent part, and it can come apart in 2 ways. In principle, someone could think that moral claims are true or false in a way that's indexed, but in a way that's indexed to something other than people's stances or the stances of groups. So it's a non-stance dependent relativism. It's a little hard to conceptualize what that would look like, but Joyce gives an example where a person can be tall relative to one group of people, but not tall relative to another group of people. And their tallness isn't made, how tall they are relative to one group rather than another is not made true by their attitudes or preferences. It's made true by some sort of standard that's a feature of the way that the world is. Now it's a little hard to ratchet that in to any type of meta-ethical framework that you could imagine anybody taking seriously. To give a similar example, if someone has a good example, I'd love to hear it so I could start using it. I haven't come up with a good example yet, but it's like conceptually possible. Now, the flip side is a little easier to characterize, which is that there are stance-dependent accounts that don't allow for indexicalization. So take a very simple type of divine command theory. Now, it's an open question whether divine command theory is best characterized as a type of realism or a type of anti-realism. My preferred way of handling this is to say that it's compatible with both, depending on the precise way in which you characterize a particular form of divine command theory. It's not like divine command theory is like one possible view and it has to be characterized in a sort of univocal way. One could say divine command theory is intended to reflect some sort of realist position, but you could also have, we could call it crude or simple or rudimentary divine command theory, where divine command theory on this view is by stipulation a stance dependent account, or what you say about this divine command theory account is that moral facts are made true by God's values, or moral facts are made true by God's preferences, or whatever God says is moral, or something like that. It's made true by God's attitudes or standards or values or beliefs. Now, you could add more to that to try to make it a type of realism, but let's just say we don't. Let's just say we're going to work with some philosophers like, hey, I endorse stance-dependent divine command theory. Okay, so now we can look at that position. Well, let's take a look at that position. Well, it's got stance dependence. It's got stance dependence by stipulation. It is not a form of realism, because moral facts, there are no stance-independent moral facts. There are only stance-dependent moral facts. But now think about what would happen if I went around saying murder is wrong and you went around saying murder is wrong, and people in one culture said murder is wrong and people in another culture said murder is wrong. Could the truth status of those claims vary? No, they couldn't vary, and they couldn't vary in the way that they would need to have a genuine form of relativism, because the claims wouldn't be indexed to the standards of the speakers or the cultures of the speakers or anything like that. You could basically say all like roads lead to God, morally speaking or semantically speaking. I guess semantically speaking, we could say. And in that case, there's no indexing to the claims. They all refer to the same standard. So there's a big list of rules. It's God's list of rules. When I say murder's wrong, when you say murder's wrong, when different cultures say it, they all are either incorrect in what they're referencing, or they're referencing the one appropriate standard. And so there's no longer indexicalization, but you've still got stance dependence. The same would hold for ideal observer theory. So if someone says moral facts are the facts that agents would all agree to if they were ideally rational and fully informed and ideally rational, something like that. In that case, instead of it being God, we're imagining a hypothetical agent. It's not a real agent. It's just like, if we had perfect information and we're perfectly rational and we're free of all biases, there is a particular set of moral standards that we would endorse under those conditions. Those are the correct moral standards. On that view, all of the standards depend on the stance of a hypothetical agent. And in that case, they're still stance dependent. And in that case, you still have a type of anti-realism. And so what you can notice about these perspectives is they're non-relativist, they are stance dependent, they're still anti-realist accounts. And so I really don't, and I'm also leaving out constructivism. So there are constructivist accounts that might say, hey, there's are particular types of procedures one ought to adopt in order to construct a particular normative framework. That normative framework would be you could even say, someone might say objective, but there would be this correct set of moral facts, but they would depend on the adoption of this particular procedure. And because they sort of pass through that sieve of the stances of the agents that are constructing these accounts, it doesn't have to be one ideal observer. It could be, hey, the correct moral facts are the facts we would all agree to if we sat down and we had a discussion about it, something like that, using this particular procedure. In that case, and it doesn't have to be a group thing like that, but the point here is that there are different ways of making the moral claims stance dependent in a way that eliminates the indexical element of them. And we don't want to rule those out of our characterization of anti-realism. And so you end up with these three accounts: error theory, non-cognitivism, and you could say stance-dependent accounts. So all of these accounts would be the standard sort of anti-realist accounts. Now, I don't endorse any of these accounts, and that puts me at odds probably with the vast majority of contemporary analytic philosophers. So if you look at something like ethical intuitionism, which is my Humer's book on this, Humer just says there's 5 types of meta-ethical position you could take on these questions. You've got naturalism and non-naturalism for the realists, and for anti-realists, you've got error theory. I don't remember in the book if he says error theory or nihilism. Sometimes people use them interchangeably. I would prefer if we picked one term and stuck with it, but I'm not in charge of the terminology, and neither is anybody else. So you can't fault people for using different terms. There's no agreed upon terminology for realism. So sometimes people say objective, sometimes they say absolute, sometimes they say universal, sometimes they say mind independent, sometimes they say observer independent, sometimes they say stance independent. So what is that? 6 different ways of characterizing it. There's probably more. I've seen observer independent. Wait, I already said that, right? Response independent, maybe you could say. You could say X independent, where X is something like value independent or preference independent. Different people have characterized it in different ways. Philosophers seem to be remarkably bad at picking a specific set of terminology and running with it. So not my fault. Sorry about that. Anyway, so I reject all of those accounts because all of those accounts rely on a presumption about what we're doing when we're characterizing these claims. Now, I frame it as a sort of dilemma. what you'll say, let's say non-cognitivism, moral claims aren't true fact. My reaction to this is to say, which moral claims? Which ones are you talking about? Like imagine someone said tigers aren't orange, or they said tigers are orange. What do you mean by tigers are orange? All tigers are orange? What if we find a white tiger? That's not an orange tiger. So when you say tigers are orange, it's a weird remark because it's not clear what you're saying. And yet you will have philosophers say moral claims are truth apt. And that might make sense if moral claims represented a kind of like a category that the content of the category is to be understood analytically, where there's just some sort of definition. It's like it's true by definition. It's if someone said, and there actually are people that might challenge specifically this, but the standard one of philosophy would be bachelors are unmarried men. So someone could say, look, bachelors are unmarried men. They don't need to say all because it's implicit in the statement, bachelors are unmarried men, that you're making an analytic claim about the category of bachelors. That bachelors as a category just are by definition unmarried men. And so you don't need to say all of them. Because if someone said all of them, it's like if I said squares have four sides. All of them? It'd be weird to say, you said squares have four sides, but you didn't say all squares have four sides. Because if you're saying, no, squares have four sides, I'm saying it's like a definition of squares. Squares, what it means to be a square is to have four sides. What it means to be a bachelor is to be an unmarried man. And what it means to be a moral claim is to assert something that is not truth apt if you're a non-cognitivist, or that is truth apt if you're a cognitivist. So if they're being treated that way, I find that to be really strange, because now we're talking about like moral claims. Which ones, which claims? I would have thought, so you could talk about these like sort of hypothetical ethereal claims, but I would have thought we're talking about what people are actually doing when they say things. So I don't believe claims have characteristics or properties in quite in the same way that you might say that a tiger or a table or a chair does. So you might say tigers have a particular type of DNA, or tigers as a category are more closely related. Like you could say literally all tigers are more closely related to house cats than they are to, I don't know, bumblebees, something like that, right? So you could say, yeah, that's part of the membership in the category, is to have this particular characteristic. But there's something weird about saying the claims have this. How do you determine that? It's just something about that strikes me as off, that this is supposed to be an analytic claim, because I don't think that language works that way, where there are categories of claims that by definition have a certain set of characteristics. And if you want to stipulate, hey, I'm just trying to give you a definition of a moral claim. Okay, now once you've given me a definition of a moral claim, this is going to have this reverse problem where if we're not going to extrapolate from what people are saying to what we mean by our particular definition, if we want to go definition first, then you're going to have a problem of applying that to what people are saying. So if you just say, look, by definition, moral claims are truth apt, by definition, cognitivism is true, or analytically, I'm asserting cognitivism is the correct account of the meaning of moral claims. Well, what if we went out and we found, let's just say you said that, okay, cognitivism is the correct account. And we go out and we observe in the real world, right? So we set up cameras and recorders and we observe all the humans on the earth talking, and we catch all the instances. And we even operationalize this in advance. So I have a glass of water, or it's clearly not water. It's limeade. And I need to get more because I'm really thirsty. Okay. So, yeah, that's what I need. Okay. Anyway, I'll go do that in a minute. I was wondering, I was like, oh, why am I having trouble talking? I think I'm just super duper thirsty. All right. And let me check if in the chat, I don't see anything new in the chat. Oh, okay. I do see there were some other comments. I'll try to get to those. Okay. 1 second. Thank you. Got a drink. Thanks so much. Oh my God, that's a help. All right. So where was I at? Oh, right. So if we're dealing with this sort of claim that by definition, moral claims are truth apt, what if we set up all the recorders and we went out and we listened to everybody and we operationalized in advance that this is a glass of limeade? That's not a moral claim. That's silly. But when people say things like murder is wrong, or that person's a scumbag, so maybe they're using thick moral terms like scumbag or terrible person, that sort of thing. that this is moral language. And then what we're going to do is we're going to analyze what these people meant when they made all those moral claims. And what if we discovered that 97% of the time, those people were not making claims that are truth apt. So you go and talk to the person and they're like, no, I was just expressing an emotion. No, I was expressing an imperative. Like we really dig into what they're doing with the language and they're not asserting propositions. What are we going to do then? Because if moral claims are truth apt, then apparently none of that was moral claims. So like 97% of all the instances in the world of people saying murder is wrong, they're just not, those aren't moral claims. Moral claims is that remaining 3% where when people say it, that is what they mean. I would find that to be really bizarre. I would think that if we're going to try to figure out what moral claims mean, that it's an empirical question about what people are actually doing, what they actually mean when they say things. And I take that to be an empirical question. So if it's not an empirical question, I think something weird is going on with the way that, with the methods we're using to address these questions and what the subject matter even is. What are these ethereal moral claims that are floating in this Platonic void that aren't characterizations of what people are actually saying and doing? What are those and why should we care about them? You know, and if we have any particular analysis, like the cognitivist analysis, and it does not map on to what ordinary people are typically doing, I find that to be really weird. Would you continue to endorse cognitivism if you're inclined to do so, the claim that moral claims are propositional, if it turned out that it's almost never the case in practice that that's what people mean when they make moral claims? I would not. I would think that's weird. So we could set that one aside. So if it is an empirical claim, then you're going to have this question of, okay, well, what do people mean when they make moral claims? Now, you have a variety of options, but one proposal, and this is a proposal that was put forward by Michael Gill in his paper, I think from 2009, Indeterminacy and Variability in Metaethics. One possibility is that people mean different sorts of things. And so the classic presumption throughout most of 20th century metaethics, and this is what Gill talks about in that paper, is what he calls the uniformity and determinacy assumption. And this is the assumption that when I say murder is wrong, and when you say murder is wrong, when anybody else says murder is wrong, that we all mean the same things one another, and that we mean the same thing consistently in different contexts. So it's not just that when I say murder is wrong and when you say murder is wrong, we mean the same thing metaethically speaking, like cognitivism. But that if when I say euthanasia is wrong and you say euthanasia is wrong, that we mean that in a relativistic sense. It's not like that, because that would allow me to have one metaethical standard for some moral issues and a different metaethical standard for different moral issues. It's not like that. It's that it's uniform across context and across issue and across speakers. It's just whenever anyone makes any moral claim about anything, they always mean the same thing metaethically speaking. That's uniformity. And they mean something determinate. Is going to be an account that is better than all the other accounts. So that account could be that when I say murder is wrong and when you say murder is wrong, and when I say euthanasia is wrong and when you say euthanasia is wrong or right or wrong or whatever it is we're saying about whatever the issue is. I'm not trying to give you an accurate normative account of my or anyone else's position on these sorts of things. These are just examples. That when we say these sorts of things, it's not just that we all have the same metaethical position, but that we in fact have a determinate metaethical position, that there is a characterization that is going to be accurate, that when I say anything about, whether it's right or wrong to commit murder or for euthanasia or whatever other stealing, lying, whatever, that one account is better than the others. Cognitivism is correct. Non-cognitivism is incorrect, or vice versa, right? So that is uniformity and determinacy, respectively. There is a correct account, and it's the same one for everybody. That's a simple way to put it. There's one account, and it's determinate. What Gill says is, hey, you've got a couple other options here. One is variability. It could be that there's both interpersonal variability. It could be that I speak like a realist and you speak like an anti-realist, or vice versa. It could be that I speak like a cognitivist and someone else speaks like a non-cognitivist, or vice versa. Or alternatively, it could be that our attitudes vary, our metaethical position varies across contexts. Maybe when I'm at work, I speak one way, and I'm at home, I speak another. Or maybe with respect to some moral issues, I speak like a realist, and with respect to others, I speak like an anti-realist. Or some I speak like a cognitivist, and others like a non-cognitivist. And so that's what he calls the variability thesis, and that's the analog to and the counterpart to uniformity. The other alternative is indeterminacy, which is that people have no determinate metaethical position in a particular context at all. Now, these are actually, they're not mutually exclusive, because it could be that, you could have one person that always speaks like a realist, one person that always speaks like an anti-realist, one person that speaks like a realist about some issues is an anti-realist about others, and one person that has no determinate position. And so that would give you a interpersonal variability, but intrapersonal uniformity for the first two people. So if one person always speaks like a realist and the other always speaks like an anti-realist, in that, and let's say everybody was like that. Let's say everybody was either a realist or an anti-realist when they spoke. That would mean that you had interpersonal variability, but you had no intrapersonal variability. Or another way to put this would be you had variation between people, but not within people's metaethical standards. You could flip it around. It could be that everyone consistently is an intrapersonal, has interpersonal variability where, everybody is a realist about murder and an anti-realist about lying. And then you would have intrapersonal, but no interpersonal, and you could have a combination of both. It's also possible that you could have, some people have determinate variable views and some people have no determinate views. So you could mix and match. The possibilities here are endless. There's all sorts of ways it could turn out that people speak and think about these matters. Now, when you look at the empirical literature, what ended up happening is that the early studies showed that people would give realist positions for some moral issues and anti-realist positions for others. By the way, if you ask people in the abstract, depending on the study you're employing, a lot of those studies do find that people tend to favor anti-realist positions, especially relativistic positions, at least among college students and people in the United States. That tends to be the most prominent position for the most recent, and the studies have done a lot to try to correct for some of the methodological problems, with earlier studies. And so that's what you're getting, at least in the US. Now, I don't think that generalizes. I think that there's some sampling issues there that I don't think that tells us what everybody thinks. But what you got with a lot of this research is at least a degree of pluralism. And that's the most popular count. Sorry, I should say variability or pluralism. The psychological literature uses the term pluralism. The philosophical literature uses the term variability. There's not a big literature. There's like 2 or 3 papers. But I actually favor Gill's other position, indeterminacy. So Gill gives this analogy at the start of that paper, and you really should check that paper out. I'll get to comments in a second. I'll try to wrap this up. I'll just mention what indeterminacy is, and I'll have a look at the comments. In fact, you know what? I'll just look at the comments now. Let's see. So I see a few people talking about how everything I said a while ago is lost from the muting. That was fun. I'll get better at this as I go along. I don't know what it is that has me. I guess everybody goofs up this sort of stuff. Anyway, maybe some people don't. I don't know. Okay, so we get this. Yeah, when I say someone is a scumbag, I mean I am really angry because they did something I don't like. Yeah, and you might say, you're a scumbag. Well, that's a propositional claim. It looks like one. And what you might mean is, I disapprove of what you did. And I don't see any problem with that. So people, but you could embed you are a scumbag in a syllogism. So you get this Rega-Geach problem for these sorts of claims. So you must be wrong about that. No, I'm not serious there. I think it's really weird to not recognize that a claim can be like, you will not go to the party, can be a propositional claim in some contexts and an imperative in another context. And that's just how I think language works. And I don't think any particular usage is necessarily more central or primary in virtue of the sort of the grammatical structure of the sentences. Just because it looks like a proposition doesn't mean that that's the typical way that it's used. Yeah, so you're adding, potentially an imperative element to that too, where it's not just I am angry, it's I am angry and you be angry too. But that when you say you should be angry, that could be a propositional claim. So you could be saying, it could be like if you're an emotivist, it's but you should too. So you should do this. That looks like a normative claim that could be a proposition. Great, I'm glad. Sorry to take a few minutes to get to that, but I'm not too bad. Today it was 6 minutes. Before it's been like an hour. Lance, I think you could probably cause explaining this, I will say. I hope not. I do think indeterminacy and variability is a little bit mind-bending and a little strange, but I don't think it should be that strange. Words are used in all sorts of different ways, and I don't agree with conceptions of language that treat words and sentences and phrases as having rigid and fixed meanings. I think that meaning is determined by usage, and what people mean when they say things is dependent on their communicative intent, and that communicative intent varies across context and situation. And we use the same words to convey different meaning, and different meaning to convey the same words to convey different meaning, and we sometimes use different words to convey the same meaning. And I don't see, like, I think this is obvious, but not, I don't lean too heavily on how obvious things are to me. And I don't like when philosophers do that. I don't like people going around saying it's obvious, it's self-evident. Okay, it's self-evident to you, it's obvious to you. And this is one of my biggest complaints. You will see this time and again in papers from philosophers where they'll say, we think this. Who is we? That, when you're saying we, at best, you're making a psychological claim for which you're probably not justified in making. We think this way. Who is we? I think, here's what I'll just tell you. There are ways of threading the needle where they might not mean something so objectionable, but I think what they typically mean is everyone. Everyone thinks this way, or almost everybody, or anybody that's reflecting on this matter adequately. Any reasonable person, or any person with like appropriate intuitions about the matter. So there might be some normative stuff baked into who they have in mind by we, but there is a propensity for them to engage in this sort of sweeping generalization where they are making what amounts to an empirical claim about what other people think, including oftentimes their readers, that may not be true. I have routinely been confronted with papers where it will say it's counterintuitive that. And I'm like, oh, I don't find it counterintuitive. Or someone will say, intuitively, we think this way. For instance, well, I'm not going to get into my specific intuitions about some of these things, or the lack thereof. Oh, I was going to finish up the indeterminacy stuff. So just real quick on that. So Gill gives this example of Platonism, mathematical Platonism. And, you could imagine this absurd scenario where you see you're teaching children mathematics or whatever. So like the teacher is teaching the children mathematics and, hey, what is 2 + 2? Oh, it's 4. And then you could say, but when you said it's 4, are you committed to Platonism or anti-Platonism about mathematics? And if you're talking to a child, they're going to be, probably, unless they're taught mathematical Platonism, they're going to have no idea what you're talking about. And Gill's point here is that ordinary everyday discussion about mathematics doesn't speak on the matter at all, one way or the other, about the metaphysics of mathematical claims. And it doesn't need to. Gill, this is going beyond what Gill says. Gill just says, yeah, it doesn't speak to that. But it doesn't need to. It's not a requirement of everyday mathematical discourse that one take a stance on Platonism or anti-Platonism. And there's no reason to presume that people are implicitly driven in their mathematical judgments by a commitment to either Platonism or anti-Platonism. Just the same, I would say, and this is an analogy that Gill floats, but that I would just say I think it's probably true. I don't think when in everyday context, when a person says murder is wrong, that requires a commitment one way or the other to any particular realist or anti-realist accounts. Now, what I can say is I recently discovered I'll get into that another time. Let me get into the comments. So I'll save that for another video where I want to talk about some more new recent research that I discovered that I think lends weight to this. And, this is other stuff where I'm starting to discover perspectives and approaches and ways of thinking about these issues that are only serving to reinforce what I'm thinking. Of course, could be motivated reasoning. I happen to pick up and want to read stuff that flatters my pre-existing, my presumptions here. But like Wittgenstein has been a big influence, but it's more of a recent influence. Okay, so let me get to some of the questions. I don't want to just talk about indeterminacy all day. So there's a whole category of these sorts of claims. Someone could also point out that you could reason, like, would it be wrong to do that? And that wouldn't make a whole lot of sense if you, would it be, should I boo? Should I, like if moral claims expressed emotions or imperatives, it might not make sense to deliberate or reason about like what the correct one would be. You could also, you could give an example like this. Assassination is a form of murder. All forms of murder are wrong. Therefore, assassination is wrong. And so you could say, well, it looks like we can embed moral claims in syllogisms, and syllogisms consist of premises and a conclusion, where the premises are supposed to support the conclusion. They only make sense if they're propositions that could be evaluated as true or false. And so they sure seem to function like propositions. So there's a variety of different ways in which moral claims seem like they function in ways where they function as propositions. So my problem with this is that the mere fact that a particular sentence, that it's not an ill-formed sentence in, say, and this, by the way, this is only true because I'm not analyzing this in any other languages. We're only talking about like current English right now. And some or all of these patterns, probably not all, but a lot of the patterns and distinctions that may be characteristic of particular ways of formulating these questions might only arise and might fail to arise in some languages, but not others. And there is this sort of weird focus on the presumption that that anything that we get out of a linguistic analysis of the English language would transfer over to every other language. There's over 6,500 languages in the world. Why would we think that they all function the same way? In fact, in many respects, weird populations, this is Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic populations. The research on those populations shows that they're psychologically outliers with respect to a lot of measured psychological traits. It wouldn't surprise me if it turns out that English is actually quite unusual in many respects when compared to other languages in terms of its structure and the way that it functions. So it might be a rather poor choice of language to focus on if our goal is to study language to study reality. We might be making a catastrophic mistake to focus so much on one or a narrow subset of languages. So in any case, sure, you can embed. So take that phrase that I used before, you will not go to the party. That looks like an assertion about like what's going to happen tomorrow. Like if I said it's going to rain tomorrow, that's not an imperative. I'm not commanding it to rain tomorrow. It's not an expression of emotion. I'm making a prediction. I'm making a claim about what I expect to happen in the future. And that prediction will either turn out to be true or false, or you could say, some people might say it is true or false. We just don't know yet. Or some people might say it will turn out to be true or false. And so it's capable of being evaluated as true or false. But in just the same way, you will not go to the party can function in some context as an imperative. And so when the parents say to the child, you will not go to that party, that locution is functioning as an imperative in that context. And so just because you could use the same structure, you will not go to that party, in some other context to convey a propositional claim, it doesn't follow that the sentence, you will go to the party, is a proposition. That's what I think is a misconception about how language works. The mistake there is to think that each sentence rigidly either picks out a propositional claim or a non-propositional claim. And by sentence, I don't here mean by definition a proposition. You could say an utterance. And so, let's say close the door. So close the door. In most typical instances, that's going to function as an imperative. But you could, in principle, say, hey, I'm going to use the code word close the door to mean, set off the alarm because the enemies are here or something like that. And so then, you're hiding and then you're captured and you're like, why don't we close the door? And then that actually is what that means because you've designated in advance that it's code word to mean something specific. Set off the, well, in that case, maybe that's also an imperative. That was a bad example because I used one imperative to refer to another imperative. You could have pinned to that. The enemies are here, and so you should close the door. So set off the alarm. I really butchered that example. The point is, you could designate a phrase that ordinarily functions as an imperative in order to make some descriptive claim, or vice versa. You could take any. In fact, you could do this for any language. You could use any word or phrase to mean literally anything else. Anything. Anything can mean anything as long as you and whoever you're talking to agree to use it to mean it that way. So the sentences don't have any fixed meaning. There are typical meanings. There are going to be statistical facts about how many given linguistic community happens to use particular words or phrases. But close the door or you will not go to the party, so you will not go to the party is not either a proposition or not a proposition. It could be either. And there are going to be some facts about how it is used in practice. And my view on the matter is that there are no other facts besides that. There are statistical facts about its actual usage. There are no other facts about its meaning. There is no such thing as free-floating meaning. There is only what people mean in contexts of usage. That's my view of meaning, at the very least. And so it's not enough to refute non-cognitivism, again, on my view about how language and meaning work, to say that you could embed them in sentences. Because what I think that amounts to is saying, or in an if-then form, or you could deliberate about them or anything like that. Because what that amounts to is that certain types of utterances or grammatical structures in the English language can be used in a propositional form. That's all that that means. It does not tell us that the actual meaning or the true meaning of that particular structure is propositional, just that it can be used propositionally. But that's trivial. Anything can be used propositionally. And then the only question is, how often is it used that way in practice? And even in those cases, note that you're dealing with a descriptive fact that nobody is obliged to comply with. If it turned out, for instance, that most of the time in everyday contexts, people did use moral claims to express only emotions or only imperatives or a combination of them. In other words, they use them non-propositionally. Would it follow that you have to be an anti-realist? Do you have to go, well, I guess non-cognitivists are right, moral realism is false? No, because the metaphysical facts are not contingent on how any given population happens to use words. That would be absurd. If we happened when we refer to the sun, didn't refer to it in its current form. Is the sun not whatever it actually is? It's not a giant ball of nuclear reactions or whatever. Just because that's not what we mean when we use the sentences. No, reality isn't contingent on what any particular linguistic community is using words to mean. So no, I don't think that would be, I don't think it's a problem for non-cognitivism. I think the question is empirical. All right, let's have a look at some other remarks. So if claims can be used in different ways by the same person, the same claim could be used in two different ways potentially. Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And I think that everybody already speaks this way all the time. And it's kind of weird if people don't recognize this fact. Now, what someone might say is they might say, sure, maybe people use words in different ways, but there's going to be a sort of central primary or like correct semantic core. And then all these other usages, they're elliptical, or they're a result of not really understanding the language, or they're using it in an unconventional way, or they're using it in a metaphorical way, or whatever. They're in a certain sense, and I think Gill uses this language, they're sort of parasitic on the central or primary usage of the particular terms or phrases or structures. And there is a sort of central semantic core to those structures that is rigid and fixed and correct. And that is consistent with there being some degree of variability. And this would be true of any of these accounts from the outset. None of these accounts, by the way, are so absurd as to actually suggest, for instance, like the uniformity accounts, which I take to be the sort of traditional and typical accounts. So someone says moral claims are propositional. That does not mean that they think literally everybody that's ever made a moral claim has intended to make a propositional claim, or because, it's not like they don't recognize that some of their colleagues in academic philosophy are non-cognitivists, and that when they make moral claims, they might be intending to purport to only express non-propositional content. They're aware of that. And of course, there's going to be, it's not like if we say the word dog refers to, canines, that if someone is learning the language and they mix up the word dog with the word log, that just because they say that's a log over there, that therefore, let's say they use the word dog to refer to a log, that therefore the category of dog includes both canines and, on occasion, lumps of wood. That would be ridiculous. You could say to that person, oh, no, the word isn't log, the word is dog to refer to the animal. And they go, oh, okay. And then they would correct themselves. And, just because people on occasion misspeak doesn't mean that the word that is like, that captures the actual meaning of the words, because those people themselves wouldn't, there's in other words, it's going to be this sort of a certain degree of cleaning up that it's within the scope of these accounts to accommodate. But I think that there's no amount of cleaning up that's going to eliminate, the amount of variability that we would actually observe, or, indeterminacy. So there's no amount of analysis that's going to yield any particular account, because no account is correct. All right. So this is an interesting one. And it's also the name of this particular live stream. I was going to talk about this particular topic. It's not based on any of my particular blog posts, but let's pivot, switch gears, and talk about this. All right. So the moral relativists are the ones objecting as much as anyone. Should they? They certainly can and may do so. I suppose it is because the Constitution or human rights. It looks like it might have got cut off. So the topic for today is, can moral relativists object to anything? And I think the answer to this is yes, they certainly can. And they're not making any mistakes or contradicting themselves when they do so. So you'll sometimes see people say things like relativism is self-contradictory. It is not self-contradictory. Relativism treats moral claims as having an implicit indexical element. If relativism is self-contradictory, then when I say I am Lance, that's self-contradictory. Because if I say it, it's true, and if you say it and you're not Lance, then it's false. That's absurd. Indexicals are not self-contradictory. So people that say it's self-contradictory are very confused about this sort of thing. I don't know why that attitude persists. I'm not attributing that to anybody here. I have sometimes seen people say that, and that's wrong. So let's just get that out of the way. Relativism is not self-contradictory. It's possible for relativists to contradict themselves. It's possible for anybody to contradict themselves. But no charitable characterization of the actual relativist positions that any person would endorse are going to tend to be contradictory. I'm not saying someone couldn't come up with some goofy contradictory form of relativism, but there are ways that are not of characterizing that are not self-contradictory. So as far as them not being able to make objections, what you'll sometimes see people say is something like this. Well, if you're a relativist, then you think that if, maybe you think it's wrong for you to steal, but if someone else wants to steal, you can't object to that. You're not in a position to condemn their actions. You have to think their actions are morally correct. We have to draw a distinction here between appraiser and agent relativism. I've done this a few times in the channel. So an agent relativist locates, like the locus of moral truth making are the standards of the agent performing the action. And on that view, this might be true. And there might be ways of finessing this and characterizing this in ways where it wouldn't even be true in these accounts. Well, let's just go with an account where it would be true. On this view, it would be something like this. So I think that whatever a person thinks is right or wrong, that's what is right or wrong for that person. And so if I think stealing is wrong, it's wrong for me to steal. But if you think stealing isn't wrong, it's not wrong for you to steal. And so because I endorse that view, I have a normative standard where it's wrong for me to steal and it's not wrong for you to steal. And so if you came up and you wanted to steal from me or you wanted to steal from somebody else, on that view, I might not have a legitimate objection because I would be saying, hey, you shouldn't steal. And in fact, I might even be contradicting myself if I said that, because no, they actually should steal, or at least it's not the case that they shouldn't steal, because on my view, it's not wrong for them to steal. And in fact, if they think it's good for them to steal, then they ought to steal. And so on that view, yeah, maybe I wouldn't be able to object. It's only one form of relativism. And if you look at, for instance, the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on moral relativism, it talks about agent and appraiser relativism, and it says agent relativism is the less common of the two. Now, I don't know of any empirical data that would suggest that that's true. I do know that there has been empirical research. There has been a little bit of research, 1 or 2 papers that looked at whether people endorsed agent and appraiser relativism, and there was evidence that people were inclined to endorse both of them. I don't remember if either of them was what sort of stood out as more favored by people. But there are indications that people, when you give them the opportunity to endorse either, they do tend to endorse. And I think it might have been even the case that people endorsed both of them. But the appraiser relativist locates the standard of moral evaluation with the person judging the moral claim. Now, a lot of times that might be the person committing the action. So it could be that I think stealing is wrong and I'm not stealing. And so if I were judging I'm going to not steal, I say, yeah, I did the right thing. And so I'm both the agent and the appraiser. But I can also judge other people's actions. And so the appraiser relativist might think something like this. On my view, it's wrong for anyone to steal. Again, if I give examples, like in this case, sure, I think it's generally wrong for people to steal. But on my view, there might be circumstances where it would be okay to steal and cases where it wouldn't be okay to steal. It's really going to depend on the circumstances. If you're stealing from an evil overlord to obtain a cure to cure a terrible disease that's going to kill everybody, then sure, then I could imagine weird scenarios where it would be okay to steal. So I'm not going to be an absolutist, but never mind. If I give examples, they're just examples. Anyway, so for the appraiser relativist, they could think it's morally wrong for anyone to steal. And if that's the case, they could certainly object to other people stealing. They think it's wrong for those people to steal. Now, what they would think is that on their view, it's wrong for anybody to steal relative to their standards, but they could encounter someone that does think it's okay for themselves to steal. That person might think it's okay for anybody to steal. But that doesn't have any sort of normative force or authority for this particular person who thinks it's wrong. Because for them, the standards that they live by are their standards and only their standards. And they don't think each person is a sort of bubble universe with their own normative framework that they have any obligation to respect or acknowledge. So, and this is according to the SCP entry, at least the most conventional form of relativism, it's at least an available form of relativism. And what you could see on this view is that, make a comparison to eating food. If I like one type of food, let's say I prefer vanilla over chocolate, and you prefer chocolate over vanilla, I'm not obligated to think chocolate is better than vanilla just because you think it's better than vanilla. I can eat vanilla ice cream, and I don't care what you eat in that case. Now, it's possible, and this is where a disanalogy comes in, taste preferences, we don't typically attempt to impose our taste preferences on other people or want other people to adopt our particular taste preferences. But there's no logical contradiction or problem in principle with having preferences about how other people act. Now, when it comes to my taste preferences, I prefer some foods over others, some music over others. I don't have the attitude that everybody should share my food and music preferences, and I have no interest in imposing them on other people. But if I did, I might be a jerk, but there's not a logical contradiction with that. I'm not making a mistake if I prefer everybody eat vanilla instead of chocolate. That's not a mistake. Again, you might be a jerk, but you're not like factually mistaken about anything. There's no mistake in saying, I prefer everyone eats vanilla and not chocolate. What's the error? What are you getting wrong? It doesn't even make sense. You just are expressing a preference. So an appraiser relativist is treating their moral standards in that way, where their moral standards could potentially be standards about how everyone else acts. And they could just think, yeah, I prefer that no one steal. And then, yeah, of course they can object to other people stealing. It's not consistent with their standards for other people to steal. And if you said, but don't you agree that other person that thinks stealing is okay and thinks it's okay for everybody to steal, why don't you have to respect that person thinks it's okay for everybody to steal? Well, it's not part of my standards to respect other people's standards, potentially. Again, I'm not obligated to hold the normative moral standard. I must respect everybody else's normative moral standards. You're not obligated in virtue of being a relativist to hold that view. That's a normative moral view, not a metaethical view. And appraiser relativists can have any normative moral standards, and that they do not require among those normative standards a tolerance for other people's normative standards. They're not required to do that. That is a normative position. And I think a lot of people are confused or mistaken, and they mix this up, and they seem to conflate relativism with this attitude that you must tolerate other people's moral standards. That is not what metaethical relativism is. Metaethical relativism is going to say moral claims are indexicalized, and then different metaethical accounts will say that they're indexed in different ways. And if they're indexed to the standards of appraisers, all that's telling you is that when I say murder is wrong, what that means is it's wrong according to my standards. And if you say murder is wrong, that means it's wrong according to your standards. And that has no implications for how I should or shouldn't treat you. It's not a normative claim. So this idea that relativists are in this position where they can't object to other people, or they're not justified in objecting, or whatever, or if they when I say can't, I don't mean literally can't, that if they did, they're contradicting themselves, or they're making a mistake, or they're living in a way inconsistent. So some people might say it's a performative contradiction. So if you're a relativist and you object to other people stealing your stuff, that's a performative contradiction. You're not justified by your own lights in doing that. That's just not true. That's only true of very specific forms of agent relativism. So yeah, this view that relativists can't object to other people's views is just absurd. It's absurd. It's categorically false. It's just not true. And yet it persists for some reason. And it's really weird, because I've seen this sort of thing from philosophers. I've seen this sort of thing like in textbooks. It looks like people just hate relativism. And so they just, I hate to use the terminology, but it'll be terminology you're familiar with. They just straw man the hell out of it. They just straw man the hell out of it. Now, you can criticize even appraiser relativism. It's not, you could just say, yeah, that's a terrible analysis. Like, for instance, if you're doing standard analytic philosophy, do you think when people make moral claims that they're all making claims about what's true or false relative to appraisers? I don't think people mean that. So what's the problem with just saying, look, the view does not have these terrible normative implications we might attribute to it. It does not result in performative contradictions. It's not self-contradictory, but it's just a bad semantic analysis. It's not what people mean when they make moral claims. So done, moving on. And if someone's, and what is the relativist going to say? Well, who cares if that's what people mean when they make moral claims? This is how we should speak. We should be appraiser relativists. You could just say, no, thanks. I don't want to do that. But done. Again, just done. So it's not like appraiser relativists gain a massive dialectical foothold if you don't straw man the hell out of their position. So why do philosophers do this? Why do people do this? Why do they have to mischaracterize anti-realist positions? And it's literally every day. I see someone mischaracterize these positions. It's because I read stuff all over the internet. It's just every day someone is mischaracterizing these views. You don't need to mischaracterize these views to object to them. Unless maybe these views are so convincing that people have no choice. At least I'm inclined. Hey, I'm happy to think. I don't think relativism is a very compelling view, but I do think a lot of the criticisms of it typically are just terrible. They're just terrible. Yeah. So I hope I clarified what I mean by can. So there's a sense of can in like the literal capacity to do so. There's can in the sense of can it without self-contradiction. There's can in a way that doesn't result in a performative contradiction or a tension or inconsistency with one's expressed standards or values. So there's different types of can. I really mean it in the last of those, that there's no inconsistency. It's not like if you're a relativist. So if you do these things, you endorse moral relativism, and then you object to someone trying to steal from you, there is no inconsistency, tension, or contradiction in that. That is what I'm claiming. What tools would one use to discover such things as objective value besides surveying what people think they mean? Seeing as that doesn't work, what tools, methods of other people suggested? So it's really going to depend a lot on whether you're a naturalist or a non-naturalist. If you're a naturalist, then empirical considerations are probably going to be relevant to a certain degree, but it's not necessarily going to be by surveying people. What you might do is you might canvass facts about human behavior and human psychology and try to piece together and puzzle out an account of, say, the function of morality. And this might require considerable knowledge of human history, human psychology, various sorts of facts that fall within the scope of what's available empirically. And then you might try to work out an account that way. That construction is going to look, in some ways, it's going to look, I don't want to say empirical or scientific, but it's going to incorporate those sorts of considerations into the construction of the account, at least to a certain extent. But that's going to be very different from the way non-naturalists are going to approach these issues. There's going to be different non-naturalist approaches as well. Now, there are ethical intuitionist approaches that are going to appeal to one's intuitions, but I don't know that non-naturalism requires any particular intuitionistic account to get off the ground. It could be framed in terms of, I guess you could say, a broad range of a prioristic reasoning that's available within the sort of scope of contemporary analytic philosophical methods. In other words, I don't think you have to specifically agree with humor in order to be a non-naturalist realist. But those views are, for the most part, going to be non-empirical, and they're not going to be heavily contingent on particular empirical considerations. So, among other things, you wouldn't necessarily have your entire position contingent on how survey respondents respond to surveys. So in those views, they wouldn't really necessarily be predicated on that. For a variety of reasons, things get complicated though. So you might have someone like Williamson or someone else that would say that, metaphilosophically speaking, that intuitions are nothing special, that the kinds of intuitions philosophers are appealing to are not sui generis, they're not autonomous methodologically, and that they actually are continuous with the sciences, and that in certain respects we are engaged in a type of empirical enterprise, but that enterprise can be handled from the armchair. We don't need to go out and do surveys for various sorts of reasons. If you look at the paper, The Rise and Fall of Experimental Philosophy, this is something that Kauppinen says in that paper as well. I don't know if it's identical to something that Williamson would say, but the general idea that Kauppinen puts forward is, to critique experimental philosophy for eliciting these kinds of surface intuitions from untrained participants. And what Kauppinen says is look, the standards you'd have to meet to ensure that those participants are understanding what you're asking in a way that's philosophically relevant and that you could be confident reflects the kinds of judgments that you want. It's too high a bar for ordinary people to meet because they just lack the training. They haven't been trained to think about these issues in a way that would allow you to partition off the potential cluster of types of errors that they could be making. So you would need to ensure that they're competent in the relevant sorts of considerations and language that you're dealing with, sufficiently competent to render appropriate judgments on this. Maybe you could clear that bar. But you need to be sure that they're giving sort of a pure semantic considerations, that they're free of any particular sort of pragmatic baggage that's coming along for the ride that's distorting their judgments in accordance with whatever the pragmatics are of the particular phrasing, the way you're asking the question and the context in which it's asked or something. You'd want to rule that out. And then you need to get these sort of reflective intuitions from these people, not these sort of surface intuitions. And in order to be confident that you're properly eliciting these reflective intuitions, you might need to ask follow-up questions to clarify. Okay, so when I asked, do you believe reality is objective? How did you understand the meaning of objective? And if the person says, oh, I meant unbiased by that. Yeah, so I think moral judgment should be unbiased. Okay, well, then they're using the term objective in a way that comports with a conventional, colloquial usage of the term objective. It is used to mean unbiased, but that's not what philosophers mean by objective. They mean it in a certain technical sense that means stance independent. And so you could then say, okay, so when I'm using that term, and I could just switch terms, I mean stance independent. And then the person might go, oh, that's a technical, I don't know what that means. So you say, okay, by stance independent, I mean this. Do you understand that? And then they say yes. And you say, okay, well, let me ask a couple of questions just to make sure. And you ask a couple of questions, they get them wrong. And they're like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't, and then I guess I don't understand. And you say, okay, well, let's have a discussion. Okay, well, at that point, you're doing philosophy. You're basically doing the Socratic method. And at that point, that's not a survey anymore. And Competent's point is, if you really wanted to be sure that ordinary people are giving you philosophically relevant judgments, you would need to do philosophy with them. And at that point, you're training them to do philosophy. You're not doing surveys anymore. That's not conventional psychology. At least it's not quantitative psychology. You'd be doing some type of really, really robust sort of I guess you could say like a really robust semi-structured interview and you could say it's a semi-structured Socratic interview. And maybe maybe that would be a good way to do this kind of research. I'm all for it. Let's sit a bunch of people down and do a bunch of interviews of that form. That'd be really cool. But the point is simply that having people fill out a survey online where they respond to a multiple choice question, like, is morality objective? Yes, no, true, false. Morality is subjective, true, false. Probably not a great way to solicit people's judgments on the matter, because you don't really have good reasons to be confident that those judgments are reflective of how philosophers would interpret those questions. For a whole bunch of reasons that Coppin lays out, that I could lay out. I think there's, specifically with metaethics, there's so many issues with that kind of research. So what Coppin ends up saying towards the conclusion of the paper is, look, in virtue of our extensive experience as members of our linguistic communities, we've talked to people, we've thought about these issues. We've already done the research to render judgments about these sorts of issues. Now, do I agree with that? Absolutely not. I don't agree with that. But the point is that there's space within the confines of like analytic philosophy for people to take different metaphilosophical approaches towards what kinds of intuitions matter, under what conditions they matter, and what the appropriate methods for addressing these issues are. And it's possible both to see the armchair enterprise as something that's methodologically continuous with the sciences or with empirical approaches more broadly, or not. And different people are going to have different different stances on the matter. Okay, let me look for other stuff. All right. So I hope that addressed the question. Okay. Can we make a clear distinction between moral facts and the other normative facts? That's a good question. Let me table that and come back to it. Remind me if I don't come back to that, because that's a big question. And it's something I've written a little bit about it, but I haven't spoken about it much. So I'd love to do that. We have I guess at this point, it's becoming obligatory for Joe to show up. And here we have this remark. It intellectually seems true that Lance suppresses the truth of moral realism in unrighteousness. So this is true. I am suppressing the truth of moral realism in unrighteousness. I love to do that. I love to suppress the truth of moral realism. That's going to make a terrible clip for someone. But yeah, I keep getting this remark. I'm amused by this. It helps me out. Relativism doesn't get rid of preferences regardless of indexing too. That seems right. I don't think I know the full context of that, but sure. Maybe that was part of another comment. Sorry if I messed that up. So I will come back to that other comment before. Do you think relativism leads to more tolerance, and thus we get this misunderstanding by non-relativists that relativists need to tolerate others? So there is correlation between people that endorse relativism and people expressing tolerance for people at different moral standards. So there is research on that. There's Collier, Sproul et al. Have a scale, the moral relativism scale, and they found so that specific scale, they make a point of saying, hey, a lot of people conflate or associate relativism with tolerance, and they designed a moral relativism scale and a tolerance scale, and they found a pretty strong correlation between the two. There's also, I think Goodwin Darley found that there's various sorts of measures seem to suggest that the greater the degree to which a person endorses relativism, the more that those people have various types of like they're more open towards other people's views. They have a less closed disposition towards people with rival moral standards, that sort of thing. So yeah, there is an actual, in practice, correlation between relativism and tolerance. So I think people are correctly picking up on that. But I also think that everyday expressions of relativism are just hopelessly muddled. And I think that they're mixing a range of different claims. So if you look at the SEP, I think it should be in the SEP entry on relativism, you'll see a characterization that splits it into 3 categories, which is meta-ethical relativism, which is the type of relativism I've been talking about. And then you have 2 other things that I would hesitate to call relativism, but they're mixed up with it so often that they're called types of relativism. Another type would be descriptive relativism, which is the empirical observation that different people and groups have different moral standards. And then you have normative relativism, which is that we ought to tolerate different individuals and groups with different moral standards. And so what you have here is a meta-ethical claim, a descriptive claim about an empirical matter about the variation of people's moral beliefs, and a normative claim about how we should respond to these facts. And these are all just sort of jumbled together. And I think ordinary references to relativism, it's some combination, it's all 3 or 2 of those, some combination of 2. Sometimes it's 1 and 3, sometimes it's 1 and 2, sometimes it's 2 and 3. So people are just really, really conflaty and inconsistent about this sort of thing. So why would it be appropriate to condemn other people's moral views if anti-realism is true? Seems like I shouldn't condemn people for liking vanilla over chocolate. Right, but there wouldn't be anything inappropriate about it. You can, and it's unclear what mistake you would be making if you did it. So I could just hate that other people like the wrong kind of music or bad food or something. You just can. You could express an attitude, you could express a view. You could say, I don't want them to do it. I don't like it. It's bad. And if by it's bad, you mean it's inconsistent with my preferences or standards, you're not making any mistakes. So this is fine. So you're right. I'm strawman relativist. I repent. Do you forgive me? Seriously. When you word it that way, it doesn't sound serious. So look, if you're going to criticize, you're going to find people that are going to be representatives of views that do express them in ways that are subject to the sorts of criticisms that I'm talking about. But you shouldn't take that to mean that the view in its entirety is wrong. So, the same way if I encounter Christians that do really bad apologetics or terrible theology, does that mean Christianity is false? Of course not. But it doesn't mean that, and it also doesn't mean that I shouldn't object to or raise criticisms of those views. I can. It's just that I shouldn't then infer from that therefore I've refuted Christianity. It's the same way here. There's nothing wrong with if someone is going around, saying relativism requires you to tolerate everybody, and then they're intolerant. There's, it's never okay to tell someone it's wrong to steal, and then you're like, okay, well then give me your wallet. And they're like, I object. Well, okay, now the person did just contradict themselves. So if someone's doing that, go ahead and object. There probably are people that are representing relativism in a way that is a bad representation of it, or at least is subject to these sorts of criticisms. You might think all representations are bad. They're just bad for different reasons, or wrong for different reasons, I guess I could say. So yeah, I just would be careful to distinguish between particular characterizations that are false in virtue of the internal content of that characterization and the view in its strongest form. Those are distinct things. And as long as you're keeping those partitioned from one another, there's nothing wrong with objecting to a bad characterization of relativism as being bad in virtue of the distinctive ways in which it's bad. That's a good question. I have no idea. I don't know. A lot of contemporary metaethics, I want to put Moore's book at 1903? Let me see. 1903, I got it. So Principia Ethica by Moore. So if someone just put me on the spot, like right now, I am not a historian of ethics. I study the psychology of metaethics. So I study the main question I've studied for the past few years is, are non-philosophers realists or anti-realists? And my answer to that is probably neither most of the time. I think most ordinary people don't have any particular view on this. And my way of characterizing that is to compare it to quantum mechanics. Most people don't have views on whether Copenhagen or many worlds or Bohm interpretation of quantum mechanics is correct. They don't have any particular view about that. And when they say it's going to rain tomorrow, they're not implicitly committed to one of these views. So that's a big thing that I focus on. And then I focus on the sort of work that's interdisciplinary between philosophy and psychology. So I'm not a historian of metaethics, but I see Moore's characterization of ethics at 1903 as a sort of springboard off which a lot of the contemporary discussion, at least to me, appears to have started, but I could be very mistaken about that. Again, not a historian of ethics. So maybe it's about 120 years old. I'm not really sure. Does anyone here have a better sense of the history of metaethics? It's not like people weren't talking about metaethics before this. So you certainly have, you have metaethical discussions going back all the way to Plato. You have like the Euthyphro dilemma and that sort of thing. And so metaethics has been, in philosophy from very, very early on. But in terms of the way in which things are, the sort of contemporary discussion, that strikes me as fairly recent and pretty close to, the past century or so. I guess you could say like analytic metaethics, something like that. It's probably not much more than 100 years old. But again, I'm not entirely sure about that. So if someone is listening to this and they do work on the history of ethics and they know that this is wildly wrong and they're like, no, it could be traced to 1822 with this publication, please let me know. I would like to actually know the answer to that. So it's a great question. Cool. Okay, so I don't see another new question, but I'm actually up to date on questions now. So does anyone have any that I can answer like right away, or I'll get to that other question? I'll give you a second. I'm going to look up real quick to see if I could find something on the history of metaethics. Okay, I didn't get a whole lot of good information, but from a quick search, the first thing I see is that it was attributed to Moore. So maybe that's not so inaccurate. I don't know. All right, so let's go back to this question here. Can we make a clear distinction between moral facts and the other normative facts? So my answer to this is no, we can't. So I'm not just a moral anti-realist, and I'm not just a quietist about a lot of the non-naturalist realist positions. So my quietist view is that I think that there's no point in talking about much of the discussion in contemporary metaethics because it's a highly technical body of terminology that has been invented by philosophers and does not mean anything. I think that they've just created a bunch of terms that make no reference to the world. They're just this endless loop, this just Mobius strip of mutually interdefining terms that don't mean anything. And that the sooner we recognize that much of contemporary discussion can be attributed to these sort of conceptual and linguistic mistakes, and we could dispense with that discourse, we could move on as a field. So that's my view. You could say, in a certain respect, it's pretty in line with certain characterizations of Wittgenstein's work. I'm especially inspired by this recent book on, I think it's 10 years old or so, Wittgenstein's metaphilosophy, that tries to offer a sort of programmatic approach to characterizing a distinct method or approach to addressing philosophical problems in Wittgenstein's work, which is kind of hard to extract from Wittgenstein's work given the way that it's written. But I find that approach to be a pretty useful approach. And so that's typically the approach I take. But so as a result, I actually don't even think certain conceptions of moral realism are meaningful. However, that's a very different thing from addressing whether there's a distinction between moral facts and other normative facts. So if you want some references on work, there's this great book, I think it's called The Atlas of Moral Psychology, and it has a couple papers that were really influential for me. One from Steve Stitch and the other from Edouard Machery. The Stitch paper is called The Moral Domain, and the Machery paper is called, I think, Morality, a Historical Invention. The Stitch paper basically, and they're both pretty short little chapters in the book, and they're both worth having a look at. So the Stitch paper, and Stitch has a few other papers. There's one, I think it's called like Delineating the Boundaries of Morality. There's a few other people that have written about this, and there's a few articles out there. And I'll if I can have the time to mention a few that I will. So here's what Stitch does in this paper. And it's just a short chapter, and that's why I recommend it as a kind of introductory, like an entry into this particular line of work. So what this work is doing is asking this question. Is there any way to draw a principal distinction between moral and non-moral norms such that we could say, here's what the moral norms are, and here's what the non-moral norms are. So moral norms are different from epistemic norms and prudential norms and whatever other normative category you want to come up with. Moral norms are like a genuinely distinct type of norm. And they're a type of norm in virtue of certain characteristics that moral norms have that other norms don't have. For instance, one might say that moral norms are distinctively overriding. They're what we should do, all things considered. That's one principled way of trying to say, here's what makes something distinctively a moral norm as opposed to a non-moral norm. Now, what Stitch does in that article is that Stitch says, okay, so you could approach this from and of course, this isn't to say that these are the only possible approaches, but you can approach this at the very least from a philosophical perspective and a psychological perspective. And if you look at it from a psychological perspective, there's not a ton of work on this. I'm not as familiar with a lot of the early developmental stage theoretic approaches like Piaget and Kohlberg. I'd love to go dig into that work and have a look at what they said about this at some point, because a lot of that stuff seems pretty interesting, and it seems to verge on or address this at least tangentially, if not directly. But what emerged out of that research is a research program from Turiel and a few other people on the moral conventional distinction. And I'm trying to remember the name for that. There's a particular name for that type of view. But in any case, the moral conventional distinction is a distinction that is supposed to come out of this particular type of test called the moral conventional task. I think it's called task, maybe test. So the MCT. And the way that this works is what you'll do. And these studies were originally, as far as I know, designed for use with children. So you take a group of, you operationalize, okay, here's what I take to be prototypical moral norms: lying, stealing, hitting, hurting. That's all immoral stuff. And then like going to the bathroom without permission, or wearing pajamas to class, or, it's the kind of examples of things that are rules that children have to follow that are not moral rules, just that like don't speak when the teacher's teaching class, that sort of thing. It's not immoral, but you're not allowed to do it. And what you do is you take those and you say, okay, we're going to define a priori, these are the moral ones, these are the non-moral ones. And then what we're going to predict is that if people are psychologically disposed to draw a distinction in a principled way between moral norms and non-moral norms, we should expect a nomological clustering of they don't use precisely this term. I think they might use nomological clustering, but they don't use metanormative. But you could say the metanormative characteristics should nomologically cluster in such a way that one set of characteristics should be reliably attributed to what you've determined a priori to be the prototypical moral claims. And then the other set, or the negation of those characteristics, should be applied to the social conventions. That's what they contrasted the moral norms with. So here's how that works. You take some action. One kid hits another kid on the playground. And then you ask the participant in the study, if the teacher said it was okay, would it be okay? What do you think children say? They say no, it would still be wrong. Do you think everybody everywhere has this rule or should have this rule? I don't remember the exact wording, and I think it does vary between studies, but the general idea is universal. So the first one of those is authority independence. Can the rule be overridden by an appropriate authority, like the principal or the school, the teacher, or whatever? Prototypical moral norms, the answer should be no. And prototypical social conventions, the answer should be yes. So if the teacher says it's okay to talk in the middle of class, like, hey, free time, everybody could talk, then it is okay. So if it's overridable by an appropriate authority, then it's not authority independent. It's authority dependent. That's one characteristic. Is it authority independent for morality and dependent for social convention? Then you have whether it's universalizable or generalizes to other populations, societies, and cultures. Yes for morality, no for social convention. And then finally, what justifies it? Why is it bad? And I don't know exactly what children say when they're asked about social conventions, but morally wrong actions are supposed to be justified in terms of harm, fairness, rights, that sort of thing. You shouldn't do it because you hurt somebody. You shouldn't do it because it's unfair. You shouldn't, refuse to share your toy because it's not fair to do that. And so they exhibit this sort of normative content. So you could say, in virtue of its distinctive authority independence, generalizability, and normative content, moral norms exhibit a reliable, early emerging, nomological clustering of distinctive metanormative characteristics that even like 3-year-old children can distinguish these. And so this indicates that there are large proportions of the population that very early on in life are able to pick up on and detect this difference. And that seems to suggest that there's a principal distinction. Now, the original researchers may not have argued this, but other people have taken this research and argued that this is some sort of innate thing, that we're evolved to distinguish between moral and non-moral norms. But in any case, that does not appear to me to be true. And Stitch argues against this. Stitch has quite a few papers on this. basically arguing that this nomological clustering, it may hold up for some moral norms in some societies, but it doesn't hold for all moral and social conventions. They sort of, you could find cases of moral and social conventions that blur or have nomological crossover, where not all the traits hold constant between the two. And so that's a problem. And then you also have populations where the distinction collapses. It's just not present in those cultures. And so this looks like a culturally contingent distinction. It's a learned distinction. It's not one that's innate. And some cultures have it and some don't. So that's the psychological approach. There are other psychological approaches one might take towards distinguishing what makes moral norms distinct from non-moral norms. Talia Wheatley and Walter Stannard Armstrong have a couple papers on this. So I think the papers are called something like The Disunity of Morality and Why It Matters for Philosophy, something like that. I think there's a second paper that addresses the same issue. I think one of them, well, whatever, I think they have at least a couple papers on this. And what they do is more systematic. So they say, okay, well, we can't prove there's no principal distinction between moral and non-moral norms, but what we can do is canvass a number of ways in which you could try to draw the distinction. Can it be drawn in terms of the two relying on distinctive neurophysiological processes? They argue the answer is no. Can it be distinguished in terms of any particular normative content? They appeal to empirical moral psychological research that shows that people moralize all sorts of stuff, and that there's no rule that says you only moralize these things and not these other things. So again, they argue that the answer is no. And then they go through one by one the different sorts of positions that the different sorts of empirical approaches one might use to pick out distinctively moral judgments as a natural kind. And they argue that all of these are unsuccessful. Now, they're clear to say this doesn't mean that there could be none. It's just that, you start to have this inductive inference that you could form, where if all of these accounts fail, it's starting to look pretty grim, the prospects for offering a characterization of moral norms or moral judgments as a natural kind. So I've seen that work, and there's some other work on this that I find pretty persuasive, that psychologically speaking, we have not managed to pick out any distinctive type of psychological state or judgment or whatever that looks like a distinct sort of thing. So then you could go and look at the philosophical attempts. Now, I think those are going to have a couple problems. One is that if they try to eschew and leave out of the empirical stuff, they're going to run into problems. So if they try to offer this analytic definition, moral norms are necessarily overriding. Well, what if we went out and we survey people and most people are like, no, they're not. Sometimes I think you should sacrifice what's moral for what's a prudential or expedient or whatever. So, you might find that ordinary people would say, look, I understand that the moral thing to do would be to rescue 5 children over my own, but I'm going to rescue my child over the 5. So they might characterize it in those terms, and they might not be confused or misunderstand in characterizing it that way. They might say that there's a sort of personal prerogative that one has that can override, or at least that basically they might not think that moral norms are necessarily overriding of other sorts of considerations, or even very strongly overriding. I don't think it's the case that morality is that central to everybody's judgments all the time. I think that moral philosophers, I bet if you survey moral philosophers, I haven't done this research, and I'm not that committed to this view. Maybe they would get it right. But I think everyday ordinary context, morality doesn't come up that often. I think it's not that big of a deal for people. And I don't think people are always going, the moral considerations are overriding here. And it's not just that I think people don't find, so I don't think people happen to act in a way where their moral beliefs are overriding of their non-moral considerations. I don't think it's the case that people, and I also don't think it's the case that people feel that they should be. I suspect that's not the case. I'd love to see some experimental work on that. And then you do have a work, I think there's that paper in Moral Saints that argues that you wouldn't even want someone to always be doing the moral thing, which I think is an interesting perspective. And so attempts to offer these sort of analytic accounts that are not going to try to impinge on empirical considerations, I think they're going to run up into at least a couple problems. One is, I've never heard any that I found remotely persuasive. Of course, the fact that I don't find it persuasive doesn't mean that it isn't correct. But I don't think you're generally going to get any kind of consensus or anything even approaching consensus within the field of analytic philosophy. You're going to get a lot of people that are like, I don't find that to be some sort of necessary condition of moral judgments or moral norms, that they're, for instance, overriding or intrinsically motivating or especially weighty in our deliberation. I mean, that's a bit vague. Someone might say, yeah, moral norms, maybe most people would agree moral norms are typically fairly weighty in our deliberations. Maybe they'd agree to that. I don't know that that would allow you to pick out any distinct kind, though, because there are non-moral considerations that are pretty weighty in our deliberations. Like there's going to be, for instance, certain sorts of epistemic and perhaps prudential considerations. Like, I have a prudential consideration to not be on fire all of the time. I would consider that quite heavily against my moral obligations, even if I don't have a moral obligation to not be on fire all of the time. Being on fire all of the time would be so bad for me personally. I would do quite a lot to avoid it, even in the face of various sorts of moral considerations. Now, of course, a lot of utilitarians would say, well, being on fire all the time would be really, really morally bad too. But I don't think that you don't have to frame it exclusively in moral terms. You could be kind of selfish about this stuff and say, yeah, well, maybe I don't want to be on fire even if it would save 1,000 people, something like that. So I don't think that the philosophical approaches are any more successful or any more compelling. And so I don't think anybody's offered a compelling account of what distinguishes moral from non-moral norms. So what does Stitch conclude? Stitch concludes there is no moral domain. It's not a real domain. I prefer to call it a pseudo-domain. So I think it appears to be a legitimate domain in virtue of a sort of linguistic illusion where we tend to use moral language and it feels very distinctive. But that distinction, I think, doesn't have any principled boundaries, or I don't think there's any principled way to say these are the moral considerations and these are not. I think different people are going to judge different things to be moral in different ways. I think the empirical research largely suggests or hints at this being true, although I don't think the empirical case for this is very decisive. I think it's very hard to study this sort of thing. So I think it's basically it's an artifact of particular languages that it looks like there's this special category, moral norms, but there is no such category. I literally don't believe there's a domain of morality at all. So it's not just that I'm denying moral realism is true because I deny that there are stance-independent normative facts. I even deny that there is a moral domain about which there could be stance-independent moral facts. So I don't even think morality is a real thing. A real thing in the sense, in certain sorts of respects. I don't think it's moral judgments are a natural kind. I don't think there's a principled category of moral consideration. I do think moral judgments reflect a particular type of cultural phenomena that is real and can be studied. So I'm not saying moral judgments don't exist. I just think that if we're talking about moral judgments, what picks those out is going to be a matter of convention. It's not going to be a matter of discovery. Even that's not accurate. You could say it's a second order matter of discovery. We're discovering facts about the conventions. Another way to put it, okay, if aliens, if human civilization is wiped out, humans are not going to rediscover chess. They're going to invent some other game. You don't discover chess, you invent chess. Now, that doesn't mean that if you're studying the psychology of chess or the sociology or the history of chess, that you can't make discoveries about the construction of chess. It just means that chess isn't like a feature of the natural world independent of cultural construction. It's a culturally contingent historical artifact, the rules of chess. And I think morality is the same sort of thing. I think it's culturally contingent. And this is the point, and I'll get to, I see a second question. So I'll get to that. This is the point of Mashery's paper, Morality, a Historical Invention. I think that's the title of the paper. And that paper argues that, well, the title says, morality is a historical invention that arose in some cultures and not others. Now, the case to make for that might sound outlandish to some people. Some people might say everybody everywhere has morality. There's another paper you could check out called Evolution of Morality, and that's by Mashery and Mallon. And what they do is they disambiguate three ways of characterizing that claim. Morality, the claim, well, actually, they characterize the claim morality evolved. And they say you can disambiguate that into at least three claims. Some of the psychological components of morality evolved. That might be true for some and not for other psychological mechanisms. It's difficult, they argue, it's difficult to demonstrate in any particular case. And each one of those is going to have a different evolutionary history if there's a bunch of distinct mechanisms, like emotion and perception and other sorts of things. Fairness norms, it could be that we have one system for learning norms, one system for expressing emotions, one system, and those emotional systems might have different evolutionary histories. So this could get broken down in various sorts of ways. I'm not saying it has to get broken down and super fragmented. Maybe there's one big general system, whatever. The point there just is that some of the psychological mechanisms may have evolved, but that doesn't mean a capacity for distinctively moral cognition evolves. So that's one claim, may be true or false for distinct mechanisms on proposal, and it's going to vary. You have to address it piecemeal, in other words. That's one claim. Another claim is a capacity for normative cognition evolved, and they argue the evidence for that is not bad, and maybe that's true. And that could be, maybe that's the case. But not all normative considerations are moral considerations. There are epistemic norms, prudential norms. Just because people have a capacity for, and just because all societies think in normative terms, doesn't mean they think in distinctively moral terms. And then you have the third claim, which is the strongest claim, which is that a capacity for distinctively moral cognition evolved. They give an example from Richard Joyce in the book. I think the book is also called Evolution of Morality. Maybe it's called The Evolution of Morality. People need to make more distinctive titles so we could find the articles easier. And Joyce gives this really robust account. Here's what moral judgments are, and it's got like a bunch of characteristics. And they argue, yeah, the evidence that there's any distinctive capacity for moral cognition that evolved is actually surprisingly not that great. And a lot of people will say everybody everywhere had moral judgments. You go, okay, well, how do you know that? And they'll go, well, they had rules. Okay, well, the rules of chess aren't moral rules. So just because they had rules doesn't mean that the rules were moral. What would make them moral? And just saying, well, they had rules and the rules were about stuff that I moralize doesn't mean that they moralize them. You'd have to give a principled account of what it means to moralize them. So I think a lot of people just help themselves to saying, if you have norms, you've got moral norms. Or if you're a human and you got norms and some of the norms are about stuff I consider moral, then you have moral norms. No, having rules against stealing is not necessarily a moral rule. So I found that article really influential and very persuasive. And yeah, I don't think a capacity for distinctively moral cognition evolved. That does not mean that I don't think that their evolution played some role in how humans think about these things. It'd be very strange if it played no role at all. Okay, so next question. Is there any multicultural research suggesting that universal sense of morality exists? So it depends. I think a lot of the research hasn't directly addressed the question. So that's what I'll say about that. So there has been research that's tried to expand the scope of cultures that are studied for the presence of the moral conventional distinction, and they find that there are cultures and populations where it does not reliably emerge. So I haven't seen any studies that provide convincing evidence that it is universal. I have seen some studies that provide some evidence that it may not be. So I'd put it that way, and I think that's the state of the research. I do think, in fact, let me look it up. I think Stitch has a Stanford Encyclopedia entry on this. That's one that maybe is worth looking at because it's more recent, and so it's probably, yeah, they do. Excellent. Let me see. It might be Stitch and Masher. Let me have a look who the authors are. Yep, it is. It's Masher and Stitch. Awesome. And so that's from 2022. Let me put that in the chat. All right. So check out that article, and I will pin it. And I think I read this a while ago, and I think it was pretty good, but it was covering a lot of the stuff that I've covered now. Yeah, 7, empirical challenges to Tutorial's definition of morality. Does it fail in other cultures? I think you're going to find that the answer is yes. So yeah, check that out. And that covers a lot of, like, you know, I haven't done this research myself. I'm going off of other people's research, and this is the research that I'm appealing to. So yeah, I don't think that there is a distinctive moral domain. And so that makes my position, I think, you know, because I'm so focused on moral realism, I'm even more at odds with moral realists than I think people appreciate, because I'm not just denying that there are stance-independent moral facts. I'm denying there's a principal category of morality for which there could be facts in the first place. Okay, I think I addressed all of the questions that people had. I also addressed the main point of this video, which is to say, can moral relativists object to other people's actions? The answer is yes, they can. And they can do so in the sense of they could do so without performative contradiction, without tension, without mistaking, but without contradicting themselves, without doing anything inconsistent with moral relativism. I don't endorse moral relativism, but I do dislike how much anti-realist positions, even the ones I don't endorse, I think are mischaracterized, strawmanned, or attacked in the weakest forms possible, in both, at least to some extent in the literature, and to a greater extent in popular discussion about them. And I think it's bad in both cases, and people need to stop doing it. People should offer good criticisms of these positions. I don't endorse them. My reasons why I don't endorse them probably differ from the reasons why other people don't endorse them. I don't endorse them because I find them counterintuitive. I don't find them intuitive or counterintuitive. I have different sorts of objections, and people don't have to share the reasons why I don't endorse relativism. But I do think if you're going to reject a position, you should reject a caricature of it. And I don't think that's a particularly controversial take on this stuff. Okay, so I think I could probably wrap it up there. I guess I'll make a final call. Any more questions? You were asking a few questions, so I'm happy to address maybe one more, and then I'll head out of here. All right, I'll give you a minute, and I'll hang out while I do that. I know that I tend to get in here and I get really energetic, and I'm like, and I wanna dial it back. So I'm trying to consciously be more relaxed while I'm here. I get so energized by this stuff. I really don't know why. You know, you are often asked to like, why did you start studying this? Why do you do what you do? And I think, honestly, I have no idea. This is what I started doing. I don't know why. I suspect a lot of the reasons people come up with are narratives that they construct and then repeat because they sound good. And then I think they're refined over time, but I think they're largely manufactured. I think they're largely fictional. I don't think people really have a good sense of why they do what they do, at least most of the time. Like if I eat a really tasty slice of pizza, the reason why I ate it is because I anticipated that it would be tasty. So like that's an easy thing to explain. But the big picture stuff, like why I ended up getting really focused on criticizing moral realism, I don't know. I don't know why. I do have this memory, but again, I don't know if it's fictional or how accurate this is. But I read this exchange between Richard Joyce and Stephen Finlay some years ago. It's like 2011, 2012. So Joyce is an error theorist. Finlay, I'm not 100% clear on Finlay's position, but it's not error theory, at least as far as I could tell. It looked like some type of relativism. I really should go back and reread that now with hindsight from years ago. I think it was some type of like speaker relativist position. Anyway, so Finlay and Joyce were arguing with one another, and the line that stood out to me was, I should dig it up because it'd be really interesting is if the line doesn't exist, and I imagined it. You kind of like people commonly have these like phrases from movies that are not the literal phrase in the movie or didn't exist at all, but they think it was said in the movie. So I have this phrase where I think it was Joyce, but it was at least one of them that said something like that, like the moral facts, like what people mean is not going to turn on what they would say when asked. I'm pretty sure that was part of this exchange, but the titles for the exchange are really funny. So I think it was Finlay that started it with the error in the error theory. And then I think Joyce responded with a paper called The Error in the Error in the Error Theory. And then the response was like errors upon errors. And then there was another response that said enough with the errors. I thought it was a very fun set of titles. And it was this really engaging exchange between both of the, I mean, this is like two anti-realists fighting about these questions, at least an anti-realist is someone that looks to me pretty anti-realist. Maybe Finlay wouldn't characterize the view as an anti-realist position. Again, I just remember this exchange. And what stood out to me about the exchange was this part about it doesn't turn on what people would say if asked. And I remember thinking, yeah, it doesn't turn on what people would say if asked. But wait, but why doesn't it? What do people say when asked? And if I were to construct a narrative, I would locate it with that point. And where I was like, maybe it does turn on what people would say when they were asked. Maybe there's an empirical question to ask here. And I don't know, see, this is why there's no way the timeline is accurate, because I don't know if this was before or after I encountered the Goodwin and Darley paper, which was published in 2008, which is an empirical inquiry into whether non-philosophers endorse realism or not. So that paper, came out 3 or 4 years before I read this exchange. And there's been some other papers after that. Maybe I read some of those. I don't remember when I read this stuff, but at some point I got interested in this empirical question. But I don't know when it really sort of took over my philosophical life, so to speak. I don't think it was quite as big of a focus 10 years ago as it is now. So a lot of things changed. I don't know exactly what happened. Okay, so I will close it out there. Thanks so much for everybody being here. It looks like we hit about the 2-hour mark. Sorry for the self-muting and then talking. I know that everything that I said is lost to the void forever. I think I re-summarized it adequately. Although who knows, maybe I had the greatest insight of all time in the time where it was muted, and I would have convinced every realist out there to be an anti-realist. And now that fortuitous outcome will never come to pass. All right. I guess I will see you all later. Let me put up the outro video and take care.